Good evening, everyone. Delighted that you could join us to the 7th Annual Jim Green Memorial Lecture. My name is Am Johal. I'm Director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Wanted to... Oh, thanks. Wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I wanted to thank, from the very beginning, the support of Vancity Credit Union and the support of our office and work we're able to do at SFU. And tonight's partner, once again, is the Jim Green Foundation. We have a number of board members who are here. Bob Williams is sitting in the back here. Thomas Bevan, Jim's daughter, Alexandra, David Cookson, and Mauro Becerra, who's the executive director of the Museum of Vancouver, couldn't be here this evening. They've been doing a lot of work that would have been inspired by Jim. Oh, and Heather Redfern as well, of course. Yes. The Jim Green Foundation has been carrying out a lot of work, not the least of which has been helping to do the redevelopment of the Vancouver Police Department headquarters at Main and Cordova, where Vanessa Richards is Director of Community Engagement. So the work goes on, clearly. And I see Gary Jobin in the audience as well. And Blade Runners is about to have their 25th anniversary as well. Just to give you a sense, the format this evening, after Nathan Edelson, I'll be introducing him briefly. After he gives his talk, we'll have time for a few questions, but we're going to take most of the conversation over to the World Arts Centre, where we'll be having a reception immediately following the talk, so I hope you can stay around and take part in that as well. It's fantastic to have Nathan Edelson with us this evening. In the very first year, we had Ken Leotier, the founder of United We Can, give a talk. Bob Williams gave a talk the second year. We did a discussion on housing led by then City Councillor Jeff Meggs in the third year. In the fourth year, local comedian Charlie Demers adapted parts of Jim Green's book on the history of the Canadian Seamen's Union, Against the Tide, and we did a staged reading that featured some local actors, including Carmen Aguirre. In the last 2 years, we've had speakers focusing on 312 Maine and social innovation, Ashley Proctor and Tanya Sermon from the Centre for Social Innovation in Toronto. But tonight we have Nathan Edelson. He's the former senior planner with the City of Vancouver for the Downtown Eastside. He was the founding executive director of Little Mountain Neighbourhood House, Adjunct Professor at UBC School of Planning. He's done many, many other things, including currently being on the board of the Portland Hotel Society. I first met Nathan around 1999, working in the provincial government on the Vancouver Agreement, where planners like him and Donald McPherson were really moving mountains on the ground in terms of how different levels of government, 3 levels of government, the health authority and the police department could work together in the context of very fractious politics and very, very complicated ways of working. So please give a warm welcome to Nathan Edelson.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the Simon Fraser University and also the Jim Green Foundation for this opportunity to speak. And really appreciate that Heather is here. This weekend, my wife Norma Jean, who a few years ago did a film called The Spirit Has No Color about Aboriginal police relations, and I had the opportunity to see Children of God, which I don't know if it's still here, but it was one of the most amazing plays that I've ever seen, and reinforced that it's not just a statement, that we appreciate being on the Coast Salish land and the opportunity to speak with you tonight. I also want to thank so many of you for coming out tonight. I was thinking, well, the refreshments must be really good here. But before starting, I wanted to ask a few questions of you just to help situate my talk, just by a show of hands. We don't need speeches. Who was born after 1972? Okay, oh, good. Okay, I need to know that. That's the year I came to Vancouver. Who lived in Vancouver between the years 1994 and 2008, a skill testing. Oh, great. Okay, that's when I was the senior planner for the Downtown Eastside. Who is or was a student at UBC or SFU Geography, Planning, or Urban Studies? Okay, that's helpful. And who had the experience of working or living with Jim Green? Okay, thanks. Okay, the title of my talk, it was publicized to be The Future of Inner City Planning. But I'd like to start by saying that I have little idea of what will take place in the future. I'm also going to talk about some of the lessons I've learned over a reasonably long period of time, and to imagine what it might be like if some of the younger among you were to find it helpful to apply some of the observations to the challenges you'll be facing in making that future. It's been hard for me to prepare this talk. I knew Jim Green, and I could reasonably argue that despite some of our differences over substance and our somewhat different styles, many of my best ideas were his. I also recalled that, and I'm going to put some emphasis here, Councillor Bruce Erickson, who preceded Councillor Jim Green as the executive director of the Downtown Eastside Residents Association, I've learned that words matter. It's not Skid Row. It's not East Downtown. It's the Downtown Eastside, a community of low-income residents, many of whom worked in the forests, mines, and fisheries to build this province, or in more than 2 world wars to help defend it. As Councillor, emphasis, Councillor Jean Swanson, and the Carnegie newsletter printed, this is the, quote, incredibly shrinking neighborhood that once stretched from Granville Street in what is now Yaletown, along Hastings toward Nanaimo, to the house of the incredible garden where Bruce and Councillor Libby Davies and their wonderful son Leaf lived for many years. The neighborhood pioneers have now been joined by many other people. Some live in expensive new housing, many students and moderate income service workers who work nearby, and then others who've been displaced by changes in the economy, as well as government housing and welfare policies. And these are so visible as they experience homelessness, addictions, and other health challenges, primarily along the Hastings, but not exclusively along the Hastings corridor, which is now between the Carnegie Centre at Main and Hastings and Pigeon, not Pigeon, Park at the Portland Hotel at Carroll and Hastings. So my first task as a sometimes radical planner is to retitle my talk. I'd like to call it Back to the Future of Inner City Planning. Think of me with a hoverboard, a flip chart, and maybe a box of yellow stickies. I'll correct the rest of the title later in the presentation. Before coming to Vancouver, I was a student of geography at Penn State and Bristol University, where I had the opportunity to spend several years with 2 young professors from England, Peter Gould, who taught me, and David Lay. Those of you who know David? Okay, I can speak more about him in the question period. But he's a UBC geography professor, about mental maps, as well as the joys of quantitative methods. Peter had us do hand factor analyses overnight on computers on adding machines with paper tapes, where we were served instant coffee in paper cups with evaporated milk. It was a hard experience. But we also learned from a young David Harvey, who taught me almost everything else as he was writing Explanation in Geography and Social Justice in the City. Before completing my master's degree in regional science at the Wharton School, let me emphasize that, at the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and where I really did take a class on friendly fascism with Rhonda Howard. I was a VISTA, that's the Domestic Peace Corps volunteer in the state of Maine, where I was giving my first hovercraft, a state car, and an unlimited gas credit card. I was part of a team that worked with many people experiencing rural poverty. As very hardworking community organizers, we felt a great deal of pride as some residents became articulate activists in Lyndon Johnson's, remember Lyndon Johnson? Well, he also had a war on poverty. However, over time, I noticed that more than few of those with whom we worked most closely became displaced from their communities and family supports as they were able to articulate the injustices that many had experienced and challenge some of the local structures of power, not only with the government and business, but within their own families. Several became isolated and died on the streets of Portland way too young. This made me aware of some of the unintended consequences of our hardest and most skillful work, and it saddens me to this day. For me, the lesson is not to stop organizing, but to do our best to help retain family connections where possible, and to make sure community institutions are in place to provide support for those who are experiencing changes in their lives. In 1970, I participated in quite a few demonstrations, both large and small. One was in Orono, Maine, where hundreds of students were opposing tuition increases at the university. How many of you have heard of Winthrop Libby? He was the president of the university at the time, and he was very old. I've recently estimated he must have been 60 years old, if you can imagine that. Well, at one of the demonstrations, he took me aside and invited me for dinner. I wasn't sure if I should consort with the ruling class, but I decided to put aside ideology and had a wonderful meal and wide-ranging discussions. As we started eating dessert, and I'll come back to this, he winked and he said, "You know, if someone could mobilize supporters in cities and small towns across the state, I think I'd be forced into having to provide free tuition and housing for the poor with a focus on what was then called Indians." I spent several enjoyable weeks in my state-owned hovercraft mobilizing support for what became the Onwards program. According to the university website, it helped hundreds of students gain access to the University of Maine by offering small, customized classes, college classes, peer tutoring, and counseling support in a positive academic environment. I took two lessons from this. First, sometimes some of our most important achievements can take place if we are open to ideas from surprising places. Second, never turn down dessert. I came to Vancouver in 1972, driving across North America in my 1968 Firebird convertible, most stylish of my Back to the Future hovercrafts ever. Professor Nick Blomley has recently completed a chapter about this period of the history of the Simon Fraser Geography Department. It was an incredible experience in that about 30 graduate students and faculty, primarily from Canada, Ireland, England, Australia, South Africa, countries kind of related, and even the United States, formed a community that helped shape us all. We learned to write and edit each other's work with relatively limited ego attachment and debated in a way we could all live to argue for another day. It wasn't perfect by any means, but as Dr. Nick reports, it helped shape each of us. It also resulted in the first chapter of the International Union of Socialist Geographers as well as the Vancouver Geographical Expedition. Department Chair Michael Elliott Hurst arranged for us to have 2 minibuses, larger hovercrafts, gas credit cards, where we could go to conferences and do research almost anywhere in North America, and a wonderful student union room for seminars and a library to carry out our work. The expedition included many undergraduates, including the vivacious Suzanne Mackenzie. Some of you may have heard of her, or you should read her, who went on to become one of the early leading professors of feminist geography, along with Damaris Rose and Sue Ruddick, with whom we worked in Montreal and Toronto. The expedition carried out research for and with community groups in the shadows of Burnaby Mountain, as well as in Hastings Sunrise, Grandview Woodlands, and Strathcona. We even ventured bravely west into UBC's territory of Kitsilano. In these neighborhoods, residents were fighting to improve street safety by reducing what we called car space and expanding parks to reduce crime and to prevent the demolition of rental housing and older buildings. Much of the new housing at that time being protested took the form of Vancouver specials, which were considered large, ugly, and expensive, and they were. Some was making way for new apartment buildings. To show how quickly things changed, as you may know, and I believe this to be true, Heritage Vancouver recently celebrated the flexible design of the Vancouver Special, and many of us are supporting a return of an updated MERB program that resulted in such a large stock of affordable rental housing. As graduate students, we spent a great deal of time reading Capital and the challenging works of Thompson, Althusser, Polancis, and even Harvey. There are at least 3 things I learned from that period that have stuck with me, some of which I still find to be true. First, income disparities are widening around the world and wealth is being increasingly concentrated. Second, the practices of emerging societies take place at the edges of the old. And third, the state itself can be a place of struggle among different interests. For those of you in political science, imagine that. There were also 2 points that we might question today. Only struggles over large-scale, privately owned material production can result in significant progressive social change. Now, this is going to be true. It's embarrassing, but true. In the 1970s, we seriously debated whether it was progressive to support the formation of unions for bank workers, government employees, or even university instructors. I may have accused some of my comrades of having hardening of the categories. Fifth, and finally, many of us believe that once there is a more equitable society, decision-making among the people will be easy. Without taking a vote here tonight, I believe many of us will question this. I'll try to weave these 5 points into the examples I would like to speak about this evening in looking at ways in which we do planning for the inner city. But let's start by continuing to parse the title of the talk. I have already introduced the importance of vehicles and perhaps time travel as we go back to the future. Next, it is important to ask what we mean by, quote, inner city. Here, I believe we need to close our eyes. Now, don't be afraid, just do it for a second. And look at our region. We think of the Downtown Eastside as the core of the inner city. I know it may feel offensive to some of us who have worked so hard to create world models in urban design and sustainability, but I would suggest it may be more accurate to think of the city of Vancouver as Northwest Surrey. Think harder. As our sense of geography shifts, we notice what is described in a forthcoming book by UBC's Penny Gerstein and Tom Hutton, that there are now many low-income inner cities emerging throughout the region as displacement, homelessness, encampments, and protests take place in Metrotown, Surrey Centre, Langley, Maple Ridge, Abbotsford, and beyond. The central themes of inner cities have to do with poverty, precarious employment, precarious housing, and associated health and public safety issues. I think it's also apparent that income disparities and the precariousness of the means of life are impacting so many of us. One recent estimate, and it was scientifically based, is that many of us here tonight may be in the 99%. As Simon Fraser Professor Bruce Alexander, in his landmark book, which guided a lot of our work in the 90s, The Globalization of Addiction, as he said, if the cause is changing circumstance over which we have limited control, the symptom is addiction. Addictions to drugs, illegal and legal, addiction to food, to shopping, addiction to you name it, perhaps social media or exercise. Some of these addictions may be in this room as we speak. And addictions perhaps to wealth and to greed in rooms beyond. To paraphrase Dr. Alexander's prescription, if the cause is a sense of lack of control and the symptom is addiction, the cure is community. A sense of belonging, being understood, a source of support and security that touches the, quote, inner part of the city in which all of us live. So the focus of my examples will be on several communities and how they can be strengthened where each of us lives in an inner city in an age of increasing uncertainty, disparity, and insecurity. Like Jim, my focus has been on helping build secure housing and to develop social institutions. Here we may also find that those who have personally struggled with homelessness, addiction, and other significant social challenges and health challenges may be among our best teachers. The examples I will describe tonight were by no means perfect, and they may or may not fit into the complex and urgent challenges we face today and into the future. But they do share some elements that might be worth thinking about and seeing if they can be adapted. First, it's important to set realistic timelines, and here I'm speaking particularly to community planners and those who assess them, so the public can experience the process as respectful. It may also help to phase the work so that some initiatives can be initiated in advance of the entire plan and demonstrate that the city is really listening. Secondly, community leaders, especially those who do the hard work of managing locally based organizations, are key to a credible process. If their organizations are not as inclusive as we hope them to be, it's important to talk with them about this issue and see how they may work with us to invite others to participate in the process, possibly to join their organizations. And thirdly, citywide and regional concerns and priorities have to be introduced into the process, but local residents must be given a chance to see how their local area and concerns are part of an emerging future for the region. We need to ask them to think of their future and the future of their children and their friends and their neighbors and the people that they care about and how they'll be affected if we take no action and behave rather than simply being accused of being NIMBY. I'll try to weave my experience with what I believe Larry Beasley in his forthcoming book on Vancouverism has termed community development planning. Planning and implementation with as well as for local residents in ways that develop and strengthen local communities and their organizations, not just develop buildings. Let's look at how some of this has taken place in 5 neighborhoods, and I'll be brief on these. Little Mountain, Collingwood, Downtown South, Downtown Eastside, and False Creek South. The first example is Riley Park, Little Mountain, the area surrounding 25th and Main. In 1977, I answered an ad in the paper from Larry Beasley, the Neighborhood Improvement Program Planner, who was working with the community to hire several staff to help create what became Little Mountain Neighborhood House. The interview panel was made up of Larry, and I say he had a pretty central role in it, as well as 13 local residents, business people, and service providers. It was incredibly intimidating, but somehow I managed to get one of the jobs. We shared a storefront at 28th and Main with Larry and his team, which included, and some of you may remember, Carrie Hutala, who went on to become an outstanding social planner, and Paul Techrobe, who became the city's chief licensing officer, and also had a deep understanding of social policy through his work in the improvement programs. I'm not sure what ever happened to Larry, but he was the best community planner I've ever seen. Over a 2-year period, he managed to form an active advisory committee that included almost all of the local groups, ranging from the Little Mountain Housing Project and Margaret E. Mitchell, who was a tough customer and who I learned so much from, to the Main Street merchants and others in between. And many of these groups were either opposed or didn't know of one another. The committee helped secure and focus millions of dollars from the 3 governments to improve streets, parks, and schools, as well as the community center. The most important item to me, and I believe to Larry, was the creation of Little Mountain Neighborhood House and Public Library to provide an array of needed community-based services and to retain and enhance the coalition of interests that had been so carefully engaged in the planning process. This creative energy led to many innovative programs, including, well, the first one's may laugh a bit, but it's a multicultural potluck dinner. Well, what's so innovative of that? Well, it probably didn't meet all the health requirements, yet it took place in the office of the health board. I was proud of that. The city's first integrated special needs child care center, where children with special needs could be in a situation, and children and parents of special needs children could be there with children with other kinds of needs, but in an integrated setting. The city's first Teen Mothers program, and this I was especially proud of. How many of you heard of Jim Killeen? The name Killeen ring a bell? Well, the broadcaster's father was Jim Killeen, the principal of Tupper School. He sponsored a teen mothers program, or teen parents program, when nobody else was thinking of this. We did it in cooperation with the YWCA. Our partner was a former single parent named Judy Rogers, as well as an innovative seniors care facility and immediately adjacent seniors housing facility, with the hope that seniors who needed care could also stay near their family partners. The development of the new facilities and programs required considerable political support, and we earned the support of several strong women who worked together despite their political differences. The absolutely wonderful Darlene Mazzari, the equally wonderful and tough-minded Marguerite Ford, and our local MLA, amazing Grace McCarthy. After 6 years at the Neighborhood House, I decided to seek employment with the city. My first assignment was taking over from Pat Weatherspoon as the community planner for the Joyce Station area. Pat had worked with community leaders to form a strong committee of local residents, business people, and service providers. This may sound familiar. That group hired Derek Murphy, a highly skilled consultant who was able to demonstrate that the existing community had a shortfall in an array of services, especially childcare, where Rita Chubnosky was able to help fill that gap, recreation facilities and park space. So as I worked with the Joyce Station Area Community Planning Committee, we identified these as well as the following as needed by existing as well as future residents who would live in the new development we were planning: healthcare services, a community policing center, a local elementary school, services for recent immigrants, supports for local artists, the initial development of a very important environmental project at Still Creek to clean up that creek. And of course, as UBC Professor Leonie Sandercock has illustrated in a wonderful documentary called When Strangers Become Neighbors, the plan supported a permanent facility for a neighborhood house to operate some of the services and to become an ongoing advocate for the community. The plan also called for medium-density housing on the industrial lands near the station and a review of what were then called illegal secondary suites. One of the hardest challenges concerned the future of the industrial lands adjacent to the Joyce SkyTrain station. The owner of one of the largest companies in the area was chair of the Vancouver Economic Development Commission, which was quite powerful at that time, and strongly opposed to rezoning. He called for a meeting with me and my manager, as well as the head of the Vancouver Economic Development Commission. Ron Youngberg, the Assistant Director of Planning who trained so many of us, went over the issues to prepare for the meeting with me. At one point I said, well, when the chair of the VEDC says X, you should say Y. Ron looked at me and said, what do you mean I should say Y? You're the planner responsible for the area. You'll lead the discussion. I'll be there to demonstrate departmental support and to intervene only if necessary. I have to say at that moment I became a city planner and still sometimes feel the confidence that Ron instilled in me. On a similar note, the city's culture was somewhat different than it might be now. The communications department was actually small, and it was available to provide advice to staff and elected officials when it was needed. Community planners and others were trained and free to speak to the media when they felt it was necessary. And this helped in our processes because the community could see who we were and we could actually speak about the actual issues as they were emerging. The law department, real estate, and finance were there to let us know options for how to achieve the public purpose, not whether the public purpose should or could be achieved. Finally, I would say get that straightened out as job number one. Finally, we were able to implement some aspects of the emerging plan before the plan was finalized and approved by council. Thus, we were able to start development of Collingwood Neighbourhood House as a storefront operation, if that sounds familiar, and supported community efforts to begin work on Renfrew Park, which some park board officials at the time had called a dumping ground that would never be cleaned up. These early initiatives helped build community confidence for the community plan and for the leaders who helped develop it. The plan was presented to council at St. Mary's Church, that's right near the Joyce Station, in the spring of 1987. Over 300 residents attended. The first four speakers we lined up in support of the plan, and finally Jonathan Baker said, I don't want to be here till next Tuesday. Is there anyone in the audience disagreed with any proposal in the plan? Now, to be honest, one person started to stand up, but looked around and thought the better of it. The crowd broke into applause, and the plan was moved, seconded, and unanimously approved by council. The plan also called for medium-density housing on the former industrial lands near the Joyce Station, much of which had been purchased by the Vancouver Land Corporation at that time, a city-owned company, which eventually became Concert and was headed then as now, or more recently, by David Podmore. When David sat down with the city implementation staff, led by highly talented Jackie Forbes-Roberts and Trish French, David said he could deliver almost all the amenities identified in the plan if he could build taller buildings. The result was Collingwood Village, I don't know if many of you have been out there, but it's really worth taking a walk around that area. And it's neighborhood house, child care center, community school, policing center, park space, and many other amenities. I have a file for this kind of outcome. It's called Improving on Perfection. Let's turn our attention to the Downtown Eastside and the surrounding and interwoven, quote, inner city neighborhoods of Victory Square, Chinatown, Gastown, and Strathcona that you've probably come here to hear about. During the 1970s and 80s, as part of the Vancouver Geographical Expedition, I had a chance to meet an incredible trio of community organizers in the Downtown East Side: Bruce Erickson, Libby Davies, and Jean Swanson, and later Councillor Harry Rankin, and then Executive Director Jim Green. From all of them, I learned how they combine community development and political strategy, including sometimes unusual alliances in creative and meaningful ways. It taught me about the importance of naming places as they transformed Skid Row into the Downtown East Side, building alliances with labor and others to prevent the demolition of the Carnegie Library and transforming it into with incredible community engagement into the Carnegie Community Center. Taking risks to defend essential housing and safety for the poor, including requiring fire sprinklers in single-room occupancy hotels, despite some owners threatening to close these buildings. And early harm reduction by regulating overserving of alcohol in the pubs when we might have had a limited ability to do so. They were able to make the future of the area's low-income community a central part of the city's political culture. This was achieved through basic community organizing and was amplified by creative skill with the media and ultimately by becoming a political force on city council and, as you know, beyond. The same kind of political struggle likely needs to be supported and take place in the inner cities throughout what we may want to call the Greater Surrey metropolitan region, to help ensure more municipalities stop trying to displace the poor and help provide needed housing and support services. My friend, former SFU instructor Matt Hearn, is in Surrey Centre this evening, helping to develop some of those leaders of tomorrow. I want to say a few more words about my work with Jim Green. It was amazing to walk down Hastings with Jim and experience the dozens of people who said hello or asked for advice or thanked Jim for helping them out. He had become the mayor, at least in the Downtown East Side, and he was almost childlike in his excitement about meeting with architects to design new housing and work tirelessly to secure the funding and ensure projects were approved by the city, sometimes no small task. He knew and made sure others learned how important it was to create beautiful permanent housing for inner city residents. When I followed Jill Davidson, who with Trish French and others helped transform an area of primarily empty warehouses into what is now known as Yaletown, we formed a community advisory committee to address an array of outstanding issues. Since Granville Street had been considered part of the Downtown East Side, Jim asked Jim O'Day, Laura Stannard, and the young Jenny Kwan, whatever happened to her, to make sure the interests of the area's low-income residents were central to our efforts. The results were policies that succeeded in replacing about 1,000 SROs with social housing and to create what became the Downtown South Gathering Place, as well as many other services for street youth. One day, Jim phoned me and said he was worried that quite a few young people who were addicted to cocaine and other psychoactive drugs were migrating from Granville Street to Hastings and creating a 24/7 open drug market. It was impacting the older residents for whom he cared so deeply. We also discovered that some of the sex trade had migrated from the West End to Yaletown and then to Strathcona, which ultimately resulted in the most significant and preventable tragedy of our time, where large numbers of women were murdered. These were some of the unintended outcomes of policies that met important downtown and citywide objectives. I phoned Jim the day I heard he had been removed as the executive director of DERA. It was a terrible day, and we walked around Stanley Park, sometimes showered in tearful silence, sometimes in epithets of anger, some of which you might imagine or have heard. In the mid-1990s, I was assigned to follow Michael Gordon as the senior planner for the Downtown Eastside. Here I had an opportunity to work with an amazing team, and I'm going to name most of them because some of them are here, of highly committed staff, some of whom you may know or should meet. Judy Rogers and Wendy Au from the manager's office, Ted Drotboom and Jackie Forbes-Roberts, who were the heads of community services, Jill Davidson and Cameron Gray from housing, Donald McPherson, who invented the drug policy group, Jeff Brooks from social planning, Michael Clegg from Carnegie, as well as Larry Beasley, Jessica Chen, Celine Mobles, Helen Ma, Ben Johnson, Peter Vaisbord, Marco D'Agostini, Yan Zen, Scott Hine, Ralph Siegel, and many others from planning. It was an incredible team that became a family in its way. And like any family, we could fight and argue like crazy. But virtually every disagreement had good intentions and was based primarily on different perspectives of the public purpose. It was rarely, if ever, about lack of commitment or competence. Having had the experience of bringing diverse groups together in Little Mountain, Collingwood, and Downtown South, I started by hosting a meeting of a large number of community leaders from different parts of the Downtown Eastside and its surrounding neighborhoods. It was a historic meeting and one that you might have read about in a book called Facilitation Miracles. After an hour, we came to two fundamental agreements that guided our work for several years. First, many of the organizations and their leaders mistrusted and disliked one another. But second, and this was the good part, they hated us as city staff even more. So we decided not to focus on that kind of approach and instead went from group to group asking for their top priorities. And we committed to working on those top priorities as long as they did not directly negatively impact the priorities of others. For instance, in Victory Square, we renovated Victory Square Park in cooperation with a group that transformed itself from the Victory Square Reclamation Society. You can imagine what they were reclaiming and from whom, to the Friends of Victory Square under the leadership of the veterans and a local architect, Richard Evans, who welcome programmed in a way that was inclusive of everyone. We also carefully crafted a zoning that in effect extended the city's historic precinct and protected many of its character buildings from what some had proposed to be a high-rise office development. In Chinatown, many public realms improvements, including development of the Chinatown Memorial Square and Chinatown Gate, community designed, and this may pain John Atkin, who hates them, but community designed street lighting and several attempts at new guidelines to regulate building character and height. Under the leadership of Wendy Au, Carol Lee, Henry Yu, Joe Wei, Fred Ma, and many others, these early efforts have resulted in Chinatown being designated as a National Historic Site, and work is now underway to gain UNESCO status as a World Heritage Site. Perhaps more importantly, young people have been attracted back into the community and are playing important roles in so many ways, including stopping an inappropriate development at the critical site of 105 Kiefer across from the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Gardens. In Gastown, we work with the Business Improvement Society to carefully craft a highly successful heritage management plan and an array of street improvements and public investments that included renovations to the Woodward Parkade and ultimately the redevelopment of Woodwards, as well as an array of street improvements. We did this while several of the local BIAs and homeowner groups banded together to vehemently oppose additional social housing and innovative healthcare facilities for people with addictions. For the low-income community, we crafted the single-room occupancy bylaw and policies to replace SROs with low-income housing on a one-for-one basis, not just room by room, but for the people who were being displaced from the SROs. We supported the creation of an array of innovative community health facilities, including North America's first supervised injection site. We also told community leaders if they came to us with joint proposals with groups with whom they normally didn't work, we would give that some priority. This led to several initiatives, including the Carroll Greenway, which had the support of the Gastown BIA, Chinatown BIA, and Merchants Association, as well as DERA and the Portland Hotel Society. So we had a real consensus, though the day it was announced, the Carnegie newsletter stated that it was the highway to gentrification, or my favorite, the Spandex Highway. So we redoubled our efforts and worked with Carnegie to reach out to many low-income residents and their leaders in the vicinity of Carroll and Hastings, and we were all found out that there was a considerable amount of community support. Given the nature of the challenges in the Downtown Eastside, the city reached out to the province and the federal governments to form the Vancouver Agreement, which is where I met Am and many others, and initiated an initiative which, in a forthcoming article by Peter Hall and Wes Regan, where they conclude, to quote one of America's former presidents, who's a little bit better than I thought, maybe, that the Vancouver Agreement has been misunderestimated. Here I had an opportunity to work with Jim and with Stephen Leary, who did so much to implement many of Jim's great ideas. When they were with the province and chaired the Vancouver Agreement's Social and Economic Development Committee. We put considerable effort into creating employment and training for local residents, and I'm so happy that people from Blade Runners and maybe other groups are here. Training for local residents and opportunities for small business and social enterprise development. Some of these early efforts were what might best be termed success challenged, but others, such as Blade Runners, Embers, led by Marcia Nozick, and enterprising nonprofits led by David LePage, Gary Jobin at Blade Runners, had to be tried and tried again and are now bearing incredible fruit. Jim mentioned to me that over the many years he worked in the Downtown Eastside, perhaps a half a dozen people had asked him for help in developing business, but several thousand had asked him about job opportunities. This is why he led the creation of Blade Runners and to provide and focused on the development of Rogers Arena. When Jim became a city councilor, we had a large part of our focus was on creating jobs and training opportunities for inner city residents through development. These requirements were included in the construction of the Olympic Village, Edgewater Casino, now Park Casino and Hotel Complex, and other major projects, and will be extended as a way of development is carried out throughout Vancouver. Jim also put a great deal of emphasis on community arts and the importance of having the Vancouver Symphony and Opera perform at Four Corners Bank and elsewhere in the community. Mark Townsend and Liz Evans, who in so many creative ways took Jim's work into the future through the Portland Hotel Society. I remember coming to a fashion show in Blood Alley that featured music and clothing designed and modeled by PHS residents as well as professionals from Gastown. The pride residents felt was amazing. One evening, the Bach Choir performed in Blood Alley. People from throughout the city were ushered to their seats and served refreshments by people with addictions to illegal drugs or experiencing mental illness. One older Indigenous man started applauding at, quote, the wrong moment in the middle of an area. There was an embarrassed hush in the audience. The second time he did it, there was some shuffling of feet. The third time, after an especially beautiful piece, he applauded again, and the entire audience joined him. The vocalist burst into tears with pure joy, and for a moment, our culture was changed. Years ago, Jim Delana Gale Bowen, who had suffered from addiction and other health issues, Jim helped her find housing at the Laurie Krill Co-op and helped her receive needed medical treatment. In return, Delana, who was recently honored with membership in the Blues Hall of Fame, started the Downtown Eastside Center for the Arts at PHS's Interurban Gallery. She has been tireless in her ways of giving back and offering a wide array of arts programming to help Downtown Eastside residents find the person inside the addictions with which they struggle. I also worked with Charles Barber for several years in what proved to be an unsuccessful effort. If only he'd been able to work with Jim to save the Pantages, the oldest vaudeville theater in Canada, as the home for Vancouver City Opera. But Vancouver City Opera is alive and thrives and is performing all over the city, as well as working with Terry Hunter and Savannah Whaling at the Heart of the City Festival, and the amazing St. James Music Academy, led by Catherine Walker. If you ever want to see the potential future of the Downtown Eastside and why so many of us believe in it, go to one of the events of the St. James Music Academy. Children from throughout the neighborhood get free music lessons 5 days a week and meals and real care and attention. As we gather here tonight, we have the opportunity to experience another focus for Jim, the development of Woodwards. Under the incredibly creative leadership of Jim and Mike Flanagan, the city developed a competitive design process and put together a community advisory team that had selected a lower scale building that contained 125 social housing units and about the same number of condos. However, as a part of a deal with the province concerning the Olympics, Jim and Larry Campbell were able to secure an additional 100 units of social housing for the community. Rather than building on another site, perhaps across the street, they decided it should be located in Woodwards. He was also able to secure an agreement with Simon Fraser for this institution. And these developments and others required the construction of an additional 200 units of market housing and led to the tower form of the complex. The result, I believe, is magnificent, but it had several consequences. The first was a considerable amount of operation from the low-income community leaders who had worked hard to support the original proposal. And second, it opened the possibility of taller buildings elsewhere in the Downtown Eastside. Within 6 weeks of Woodward's approval, I received 12 serious inquiries about other high-rise development in the neighborhood, including Army and Navy. Please don't get me wrong. I think Woodward's is an amazing achievement, and it's just an incredible combination of uses. But it did come at a cost. Some argued that low-income residents would feel intimidated by the nearby condos. I don't believe this is proven to be true. Tanya Fink, who's here tonight, an absolutely committed and courageous young planner, found when she carried out a survey of residents that the residents in the social housing really enjoyed it and were actually welcoming of the condo residents into some of their facility. It's also been seen as a cause of gentrification and displacement. While I could be wrong, I think the area is a subject to market investment because it's close to a vibrant and growing downtown, contains many attractive buildings and views of the mountains and waterfront. What is holding some of that investment back is the heritage character and zoning we fought so carefully to craft and to protect. In one of my last acts as senior planner for the Downtown Eastside, Jim convened a meeting with Westbank and Gregory Enriquez and others with staff from Housing and Planning to review a proposal for a 400-foot tower on Pender Street across from International Village. It would contain 100 units of social housing at no cost to the government. I believe Jim was serious about this and that he would make sure that those units were provided. While the proposal was attractive, I spoke against it right at the meeting. How dumb was I? I felt there would be a precedent that would make room for other towers in the area. I said I was concerned about the height because it might make the heritage buildings look out of place, but I was more concerned about the width of development in that gentrification could take place a half a block at a time rather than building by building or lot by lot. Every owner would disinvest in their older buildings awaiting opportunities to be bought out, and the city would not be able to provide enough incentive to save much of anything. This was the one time I found Jim to be furious. He spent, at me, he spent the next few months organizing others who were interested in taller buildings. One result was the Chinatown Height Review, which is still the subject of debate in that neighborhood. I was also concerned that this might challenge my friendship with Jim. So I took the courage and challenged him to a beer at the Yale pub. We talked a great deal about things past and present, and I told him about my concern that we might lose our friendship. And he got up from his bar stool, and he's towered above me, and told me to stand up and embraced me in a hug that I can still feel as he said, and I think I'm quoting this correctly, "Everything will be all right." I'm just going to say a few more words. I'm sorry if this is going on long, but I'll make the points anyway. I want to just briefly talk about False Creek South. When Team was elected in the late 60s, early 70s, it was elected to stop the freeway, which would have gone right through the east side of the city, destroyed Chinatown and Gastown, and gone along our waterfront up to UBC. It stopped the freeway. But in addition to that, under the leadership of Councillor Colleen Hardwick's father, Councillor Walter Hardwick, Team led an effort to redevelop the basically abandoned industrial land along the waterfront on the south side of False Creek between the Burrard and Canby bridges. And they developed it in partnership with the senior governments and the community and private sector into a highly livable, medium-density, mixed-income community. It's a world model. 80% of the land is owned by the city, and most of the leases for the co-ops and stratas will end in 2036 or 2046, with some ending in as few as 3 years. After more than a decade of work by the community with the city, not one lease has been completed. And after the break, I'll hold a 3-hour seminar on the lease discussions. The False Creek South Neighborhood Association was formed by the city. It has elected representatives from every one of the housing enclaves, the stratas and the co-ops, and now the nonprofits are also being welcomed into that group. It formed what's called the RePlan Committee. And the RePlan Committee has asked for 3 simple things. First, get the leases done. I guess we'll leave off the word stupid. Maybe it has to come back. Secondly, a community plan. A community plan that includes a considerable amount of additional affordable housing in the existing neighborhood as well as adjacent city lands along 6th Avenue. But they want that to be, in a rough sense, in keeping with the character of the existing neighborhood. And then thirdly, they want to be able to explore alternative methods of governance to implement that plan. We're not sure exactly what form that could take. It might be a housing trust, it might be something else, but they want to work with the city and other citywide interests, but for the community to have a real say in implementing the plan and not to have to be protesting when one private developer says, well, the economics have changed, we need another 10 stories to give you 10% of what the plan committed to. They want to have some control or impact on the future development. Instead of, actually, I probably won't speak for 3 hours later. But I think what's bogged things down are two worldviews. In one, we are talking about sustaining a long-standing, successful, diverse community that will allow residents to be partners in guiding change. That's the good perspective. I think that's what we'll call it, the good perspective. Words matter. The other perspective is that there should be short-term leases and that within 10 to 20 years, the city can take back its land and redevelop whatever it wants. So by way of closing, I'm just going to make 7 brief points. You can count them. First, I want to complete the retitling of the talk, the future of community development planning in our, with a capital O-U-R, inner cities. The inner cities that all of us are part of. In addition, secondly, in addition to sustainability, ending homelessness should be our top priority. Comparing Vancouver or Greater Surrey to other regions around the world, given our wealth, we're substandard in our success in addressing homelessness, that we shouldn't have any. We have the wealth, we have the resources, and in addition to that, it's more expensive, as we know, to have people homeless than it is, and in our hospitals, in our jails, in our other health facilities, our policing costs and so on, than it is to have them in housing and receiving the appropriate health care. I hear Jim clapping. Secondly, the next priority should be housing for our workforce. Every area of employment should have housing that could accommodate the kinds of workers that are being attracted to that employment area. People shouldn't have to to commute an hour and a half to get to a moderate income job in the city. We should figure out ways of getting them housing near where they work, and really struggle to do that. There's enormous public cost savings, not just in transportation, but who's looking after their kids? And what's going to be the generation after that? Thirdly, high density has a role in our region. It definitely does. I stand behind some of the I wish some of it had been developed a little bit differently as we see it develop, but I'm proud of the work that our department did in False Creek North, in Yaletown, in Collingwood Village, and that other municipalities are doing now in many of the centers within our region. It's really amazing. The high-rise actually creates the base for strong neighborhood centers in the right places. But I'd have to say, and probably I'll echo Jim's word, shoving high-rises up people's arterials near transit so they can get to somewhere that's bearable quickly is not a good form of urban design or development. Neighborhood centers are the key to successful communities. We're trying to do community development planning, not just building buildings. Finally, we need to put a focus on commercial spaces that are affordable and suitable to the needs of nearby residents that should be reflecting a diversity of incomes and a diversity of needs, including low-income and moderate-income workers, as well as others. And there are policies we could put forward. One simple one, which probably is wrong, but I'll throw it out anyway. Why are we servicing new commercial buildings from the lanes rather than the street, like real cities do? Well, what that means is there's a tremendous amount of wasted space, and it makes it next to impossible for small businesses to enter the new developments. That's why, I think part of why we get the shoppers and other larger businesses, nothing against them, but it doesn't allow for the flexibility of space. Perhaps choice of use on the second floors. Perhaps a kind of affordability scheme so that at least some merchants who have a proven track record can face a cost of living increase rather than enormous skyrocketing rents when new development takes place, so they can remain in the community and continue to do the community building, community development that they are meant to do. So those are my main points. And my final point is keep your hovercraft powered up and never miss dessert. We're about to have it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nathan. We're unfortunately over time for a Q&A, but we are going to be having a reception in the World Arts Centre on the second floor where you'll be able to speak with Nathan directly. You can go to it either outside those doors on the third floor or come out these doors to the World Arts Centre. So thank you very much to Nathan Edelson. And thank you to the Jim Green Foundation.